Hi everybody. This short lecture will take a look at the article that was assigned for Unit 1B, which is focused on moral licensing. So hopefully together we'll be able to make a bit more sense of the material. When I was involved in the union movement, if there was ever a complaint that somehow the work that the union was doing was helping some workers but causing harm to some other workers, we were always told that, well, you have to break a few eggs to make an omelet, and that in the course of trying to create some kind of social justice or improvement, that oftentimes there were some people who got hurt, but that was just the reality of the world, and that eventually the union would be able to produce good outcomes for everyone who was involved. I always felt uncomfortable with this idea and sometimes would challenge this idea that it was okay to sacrifice a few for the many. If you've taken the time to listen to the podcast by Malcolm Gladwell, and you've taken the time to read the Blanken, Van de Ven, and Zeelenberg article, then you'll be pretty familiar with the concept of moral licensing. This idea invites us to kind of question some of these concepts that if you do something good, you can then be exempted from doing future goods, or that doing something good can balance out against somebody doing something that is harmful to others. And for leaders, we probably need to pay attention to this idea of moral licensing and the faulty logic that we can exchange some kind of good for some kind of harm and have things equal out and produce goods or justice. There are many ways in which we might want to think about these ideas and reflect on things that happen in our own workplaces or in our own practice that exemplify or provide examples of moral licensing and its faulty logic. Blanken, Van de Ven, and Zeelenberg invite us to think about the way in which we might excuse ourselves from engaging in good behavior when we have engaged in moral behavior previously. They suggest, in fact, that people tend to believe that they can behave in an immoral way or an unethical way once they've done something good. And certainly the work by Gladstone invites us to think about both historical and contemporary examples of the way in which this might operate. I'm sure if you think about some of the policy decisions that were made by the federal government and by the provincial government in light of the COVID-19 crisis, the pandemic, we can see this at operation as well. For example, the idea that if you're someone who works in a grocery store or another essential service and you leave your job, you quit your job for whatever reason, you're not eligible to receive benefits under the emergency benefit plan. The authors suggest that moral licensing theory builds on a kind of liberal humanist and foundationalist approach to understanding morality and ethics. And if you recall from social policy class, we certainly looked at foundationalist perspectives and various forms of liberalism, or different continuums of liberalism, which challenge this idea that we only look at morality and moral or good behavior as building on some kind of a ladder or a foundationalist perspective. So we'll have just a quick look at some of the theory that underlies this. It's not contained in the readings, but this is just a bit more information you might find interesting. If you've taken a social work moral theory course, then you've probably looked at perspectives like deontological or teleontological or utility theory, each of which presents their own way of understanding how one makes or engages in moral decision making. Well, when we think about liberalism and we think about the continuum of liberalism from traditional liberalism through to a post-liberal perspective, we know that there's not one understanding of how one engages in moral decision making. So traditional liberalism and liberal humanism does work on the basis of a foundationalist perspective, or this idea that one engages in in consistent ways of thinking, and that thinking is almost like climbing a ladder. But we know that in a post-modern, post-structural, or post-liberal perspective, we're more concerned with context and what context means for people who are engaged in moral decision making. And well, I guess some people would argue that moral licensing is another way of thinking about context, or how it is that people might make different decisions in different bases, in different contexts on different bases, depending upon what resources they have available and what limits there are to those resources. And I'm sure that Trudeau would make an argument that he is trying to mobilize resources and share those resources among a number of competing groups and competing interests, and for that matter, competing goods. So we may also want to think about this concept of moral licensing as something that needs to be made more complicated, or that requires maybe a more nuanced understanding. Well, I don't think that moral licensing is the be-all and end-all of theories, or that it can necessarily be some kind of a key to opening a magical box of leadership skills. I do think that it's important for us to think about how we are engaging in decision making, and how it is that we sometimes justify particular actions that do harm people in our organizations or the clients that we're serving because of particular phenomena that we feel are more important. So for example, when we pit workers against clients, or when we make decisions about the application of safety or policy and procedure, and that harms some and helps others. I guess it's one of the possible ways that you can think about decision-making processes and outcomes as you're working towards understanding social work leadership better. I hope that you enjoyed the material by Gladstone, and I hope that you take a few minutes to watch the supplemental video, which is a conversation that Gladstone has where he presents a number of interesting examples from his own life where moral licensing affected his own life experience. We'll have an opportunity to have a bit of a discussion about this in the discussion board on Flipgrid, so I'll look forward to participating in that discussion and hearing what you have to say. Of course, we'll also be meeting by Zoom, so perhaps some of the moral licensing perspectives will come up in that conversation as well.